everyone, this is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots and Genealogy. Be sure to check out our blog, our YouTube channel, and our Facebook group, and our great sponsors, Abitiva Casa, Italy Rooting, and Phil Italy. And my guest today is English professor, author, and poet, Christina Morocco. So welcome, Christina. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation.
So we certainly want to talk about your books, but before we do that, what's your Italian background? Where's the family from and where did they settle?
Okay. Both of my grandfathers are Sicilian American only, and their parents were the immigrants. So in that big wave of immigrants from the South, they came. And the Moroccos are from Alcamo, so Alcamese, Sicily, and the Inzinas, who became the Zinos through some kind of transformation of last names, they're from Colisano, which is right up the hill from Cefalù. So also Sicilian there. The Moroccos settled in the Little Italy neighborhood over off of Taylor Street in Chicago. And my mom's side, the Inzina Zeno group, they settled in Melrose Park, which was another Little Italy-esque community just outside of the city of Chicago.
I have to ask my friend Francesco because I think he may be from Colisano. I'm not sure. I know he's only about 20 minutes from Cefalù.
Yeah, it's right up in there's like we would call it a forest preserve, right? A national park, a national forest up in that area. And it looks like Colisano is I have not been there yet. So I spy on it a lot, right? Like, what's happening in Colisano? And when can I get there? And it looks, it looks like home, even if you have never been there. So there's that strangeness that happens, but it's like a beautiful place.
Yeah. And you have to get there. Once you get to the hometown, it's like so special and everything. So I know a little bit about Chicago because I used to work for Chase and I used to go like 4 or 5 times a year. Okay. And so I know there used to be a great Italian restaurant there. What was the name of it? Angelina's.
Okay.
And it was like actually in a house and in like a residential neighborhood. It was the strangest place, but it was really, really good because it was like eating at home, But what's the history kind of from the Italian neighborhood in Chicago?
Well, those two neighborhoods kind of have a different history. The Taylor Street neighborhood in Chicago, I mean, it still exists, but it exists on a much smaller, very different scale now because expressways went in, VA home went in, university went in, and there was a lot of fighting during that time. And you can read about that with there's tons of information out there on it. But many of the residents, including my great-grandmother, Nina Canone, who's became a Morocco, she was a widow at the time and she was moved out of her home, right? People were displaced. And I think that the memory of that displacement is very much in what is now that particular Little Italy. There were a couple of them in Chicago and also Little Sicily, but that area really got kind of fragmented and splintered up in a lot of ways. And it's very expensive as well. So if I wanted to go back down there and say like, let me go reconnect to my roots and go live on Taylor Street or off of Taylor Street, I could never afford to do so. So it's very, very gentrified at this point. And then a lot of the roads, the street that my family lived on, which was Almond, no longer exists. The entire street is gone. And so it's very hard to even reference it because unless the person is 85 years old, they don't remember Almond Street anymore. So that's the city portion. The other side of the family, Melrose Park, it was a more gentle, I think, drifting away from the area. The neighborhood had originally been very German. It became very Italian. And then, there's still some pockets where it's very, very Italian, but a lot of the people have drifted west into the other suburbs. So if you go looking to reconnect with those places as they were, it's not going to happen. And you have to make a decision, I think, as a 3rd generation or 4th generation person. Is it better to leave it in the memory with the stories and the descriptions that we have? Or is it better to venture into the space? I was So my son plays tuba, one of my sons, and he was in the band for the feasts, going around in the neighborhoods
Oh,
for a
yeah.
while. And we went to the Feast of St. Rocco, which is in another Italian American neighborhood in the city, which has become very much a Chinese American neighborhood. And I was observing my fellow Italian Americans who were following the procession. And it's really an old school procession there. I mean, you stop in front of people's houses. There is food out. There's a lot of conversation. But what I also noticed was that people would run up onto the front porches and the staircases of the houses that had been in their families. But other people were living there, right? And those other people came from a completely different culture. And there wasn't friction, but there was this like surprise sort of feeling, right? And I think that's what happens all the time when you have enclaves, and then the enclaves Americanize and change. And I probably have gone on too long about it, but it's just something that I'm interested in, and I watch, and I wonder about Little Italies when they become sort of, for lack of a better term, Disneyfied. They're almost doing a costume show of what it is to be a Little Italy, and also those that start to dissipate. And I'm also really interested in those that have held tight. And I think Melrose Park, in its way, in pockets, kind of does really try to hold tight to that history. But that history, of course, we still have people coming, right? But the history of those early Southern Italian immigrants.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. And, the first part of what you were talking about, people don't realize that a lot of those Italian neighborhoods were cut in half or destroyed. People think that it's only happened to other ethnic groups, but it happened to us in lots of places. In New York, definitely. I mean, when they put roads in and things like that. And then the other thing that you mentioned too was how they've lost their identity. A lot of these Little Italies in New York, Little Italy in downtown Manhattan it's not Little Italy anymore. They still have like you said, the Disneyfied version. Really, the only one that I know of that probably held true is Arthur Avenue in the Bronx.
Avenue, yeah.
Yeah. But
I went there a couple of times and I was like, yeah, the air is right. It feels right. And I think, to put a finer point on it, when these neighborhoods were broken up by highways and hospitals and whatever, that wasn't accidental either. I don't think it ever really is.
No.
But in Chicago, it was a very pointed fight between the mayor and an Irish American faction that was really, had a lot of control in policing and city planning and politics and schools. And there was this back and forth with the Italian American community. And I think that fed into it. Studs Terkel and Francis Scala, and there was such a fight, but the fight couldn't be won. And if I think about my own great grandmother, Leonarda Nina, who was moved out of there, she was already elderly. She was an Italian speaker pretty exclusively. All of her friends and her neighbors and people from the village she had come from lived around her. And when she was moved out, she went to live with her children. She had 11 children, so she kind of would stay with people. And she didn't live very long. And a lot of that was heartbreak because she had left her first home willingly, but probably missed it and never saw those people again. Made a second home, became very, very attached to it, and hoped to live out her days there, and then couldn't and didn't have it in her to try to make the third home. Really wasn't possible for her. And like you said, it happens to other groups too. It's not just us, but it's also not just other groups. And there is a price to pay, I think, particularly for the grandparent generation, whoever they may be at the time.
We'll be right back.
Experience Italy like never before, traveling with a scheduled group or create your own bespoke tour with friends with philitaly.co. Pack your bags and follow Phil. That's www.philitaly.co. Yeah, yeah. I mean, the area that I'm from, or my parents are from in New York, Corona, there's hardly any Italians there anymore. I mean, it's pretty much all gone. And you know, again, you had that spread, from urban to suburban to like way out there type of thing. Yeah. But
Yeah.
that's a good point. Like you said, you don't think about it, because that was interesting what you said, that she left her first home willingly, and then the second one not so willing. That's
Yes. Kicking and screaming, really,
hmm,
as much as she could. Yeah. And I think my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation all lived in areas where they heard their language every day, um, in the house, but out of the house, right? In the shops, neighbors. And it wasn't just the language, it was the sensibilities of that, the reality of it. They were part of a group that understood themselves with a lot of variety, but in a way, right? They were of they were a culture. They were a culture together. And I think for my generation and a lot of the generations after us, because we're not living in those, at least, we are, if we're interested, we're trying to hold whatever that is to be Italian American on a tiny, tiny scale in our own home. And it's a different load to lift. Uh,
yeah,
and it being imaginary. And how do you make it real? How do you look at your ancestors, and how do you visit the places? How do you learn the language? How do you reclaim these things? Well, you're also very much an American.
yeah. And there are a few Italian associations that send a few kids over there every year, but you know it's the one thing that the Jews have done is they've sent hundreds of thousands of American kids to Israel to see it, and we don't do that. You have to be a select group, you have to be in a club, you have to be a member of this thing or that thing, uh,
Uh-huh.
but we don't have anything that's organized to get the well now 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds or 20-year-olds over there for 2 weeks or a month or something like that. I mean, it does
Yeah.
happen, but it's not organized the way it should be when there's tens of millions of us here.
Yeah, and it seems to be more of a one-off thing, or a rarity, right? So if I think about Hebrew school, Greek school, Polish school, a lot of my
Polish, yeah.
Polish students have Polish school. They go and they're learning Polish, they're learning history, they're keeping that culture. There's an effort that starts at a very, very young age. And it includes the parents, making sure the kids get there. And I think that you almost can't have the thing when they're older where you send them over. That can't be vibrant unless you have a fertile ground when kids are young, where they're understanding that, from a very early age, this is a part of me. And one day I want to go there, and this is part of my identity. And I have some aptitude with the language or the expectations, or just the way we hold our bodies, like so
Hmm.
many cultural things are from being around people, right? You become the people that you spend time with, and you're going to spend time with all kinds of people from all walks of life. But I think what the Jewish population to a degree, and the Greek population to a degree, and the Polish population to a degree all do is that they make sure that that's included in their
Right.
kids.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm sure I would have hated to go to Italian class when I was 10, but I wish
Yeah.
I wish somebody forced me. They didn't exist.
Why didn't these people force me to learn piano, and also, whatever, for my own good? And then as adults, we say we wish, and then we have to kind of go and say, well,
My
let me.
my parents, they spoke dialect. They didn't speak Italian. My
Mhm.
father spoke Neapolitan. My mother spoke Barese. Um,
Yeah.
but you know, uh, we made friends. We were in my mother's hometown a couple of years ago, and Rocco sent a video, and it's coming up the night of the Bakers, which I think is kind of just in Torito, just in that one town. And they do this thing where I guess the loudest guy probably in the town walks down the street and he starts, talking in Barese. And it clicked right away. I said, that's the sound I know. That's the sound I remember from my grandparents, my uncle.
That's the cadence,
and it's different
right?
from Italian. It's different.
It's different. It's held in a different part of the chest, in the mouth. The words are different. The cadence is different. The music is different. So my great aunt was Barese. So I heard her. I heard a lot of Sicilian. And I've been studying Italian for a while on my own, and now I'm taking some classes at Casa Italia, which is great. And I traveled and tried out my Italian, and that was wonderful. But I go to my parents' house and I say something, and they look at me like, "What's that? Why are you talking like that? That's weird." And then my mom gets very like, "That's not our language. That's not the language that my father spoke. That's not the language that my grandmother spoke." But as an American, I have to also look at it in a way like Italy has changed. And I would love to learn the Sicilian language as well. But I also want a language that can take me around in Italy so that I can travel. And I think the standard Italian is probably what that is at this point.
Well, our Italian class, we have our teacher is from Veneto, but he speaks proper Italian, but he points out some of the differences. And then we have guys from Naples and opining on what they used to hear, and some of that stuff I heard because of my father's family. But I wish I paid more attention to English when I was younger, because passive tense and future present and all that kind of stuff is making me nuts.
You don't really learn that stuff until you're trying to learn a new language as an adult, and you have to figure out the mathematics of it, right? When you're a kid, you're just listening. It all seeps into that sponge of a brain that we used to have. And I think too, like, the Italian that's the proper Italian is the proper Italian because a decision was made, right?
Yeah.
Napolitan and Sicilian, and even varieties of Sicilian, like Alcamese, or varieties of languages were a little different in this town and outside of Naples than they were in, the city of Naples. Or, like those, in my heart, those are languages, and they're not less than the thing that we call Italian now, formal Italian. I think, for a long time, we referred to them, the dialects. I remember people saying, "Oh, I just speak dialects. Oh, I just speak dialect." But that's a full form language.
That was their language. Yeah.
That was their language. And it's a beautiful language. And when I was sitting in a hospital lab waiting to get blood work, and two people walked in speaking Sicilian, and I don't speak Sicilian, but I had heard enough of it that I could not stop listening to them. It felt like I was transported, back to my childhood with all of these people sitting around, drinking coffee and talking. And I asked them, and they,
yeah. And that's the way I kind of felt in Torito and in Bari, because that's what I heard the most. I was mostly with my mother's family. So I associate more with that. But I always thought they were speaking Italian, growing up. I didn't realize until later on that they were speaking Barese.
Because it was the only Italian we knew, right?
Yeah.
That was the one we heard.
And as I mentioned this to somebody else, when people were, when I was a lot younger and all my cousins were getting married and all of that, my Aunt Mary used to hold the bag with the envelopes, right? And she used to say busta. And I always used to think, she didn't say busta, she said bust, right? She didn't, they didn't put the A on. And I always associated that with like a helping, right? Like it was a boost. I didn't, like it was money to help you get, and I didn't realize until just a few years ago when I said, busta, that's what she was saying, envelope. And she also used to say, if something was expensive, she would say it was dear, caro, but she would say dear. She would translate it, but that's because of the Italian word caro, which also means expensive. And that doesn't
Right.
just mean dear. And so these things started popping in my head just a few years ago. And I'm like, boy, I wish I had asked more questions,
Right. Definitely. I wish we would have taken out our Memorex tapes and our little tape decks and recorded a lot of that receptacle of all of those memories and all of that knowledge. And the more you can have, the better. But we don't know that when we're children, and maybe we're not supposed to, because that's a pretty heavy task to try to carry all of that into the future. But I think we kind of by osmosis, we carry a lot of it.
Well, yeah. And, I interviewed somebody who's deep into genetics and DNA and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And she said, we don't just inherit physical DNA. We inherit, the mental DNA too from our ancestors. And she said,
Yes.
so if you had an ancestor that was frightened by fire, you may be frightened by fire, but you don't know why.
Yes, the whole epigenetic memory, right?
Mm-hmm.
How does that work? As a person who used to be terrified of spiders, when I learned about epigenetics, I thought, oh, who got bitten by a tarantula? Yeah, I think we do. We carry that. And for a lot of Americans, it's coming from a lot of different directions, because a lot of us have, we might be half Italian and then we're half something else. Maybe, we're Irish and the people were, fleeing the famine, and were German and they were fleeing conscription, and they had their own famines. And, and then what happened when they arrived here? And it gets passed on in the behaviors, and it gets passed on, it looks like, in the genetics as well. And I think, but also their joys, and also the things that they loved,
Uh-huh.
not just the trauma, not just the challenges. So I think it is a mixed bag, but yeah. And
Well,
it's really
yeah.
interesting because on my DNA, I'm actually more Sicilian than either one of my parents are singularly.
Yeah.
Somehow I inherited more of that genetics when it did its thing and mixed all together. So, who knows?
It's the jelly bean test. Do you ever hear of that?
Mhm.
So so that's a simple way to explain genetics. And I think it may be 8 different colors, if I remember correctly. If you put um, 46 jelly beans of different colors in a bowl, and you pick, maybe it's 64. Anyway, you put some number in there. You pick, 23 or 46, and I pick 46. They're not going to be the same, even though we're picking from the same bowl, right?
Right.
So, everybody thinks, well, I'm nothing like my brother or my sister or anything like that. But that's I always use this as an example. My brother could draw anything. I can't draw a straight line.
Right.
Come from
You
the
were
same
raised in the same
parents.
home. You had the same opportunities to learn to draw. Yeah. Yeah.
And so there's something, again, it's not just the physical that you inherit. It's everything else. So now,
Mhm.
so you wrote a couple of books. Are they both about the family?
One is, and one is not. And actually, I'm going to mention this real quick. Before I wrote the books, when I was in graduate school, I did my doctoral thesis, or my doctoral dissertation, I should say, on the evil eye in Italian American literature. So I
Oh,
was
yes. I was going to ask you about. I'm glad you brought that up
always
because I was going to
interested in
ask you
that.
about
So
that.
that was my first kind of writing foray into things Italian American. And then I wrote this book, which is Adio Love Monster. And this is fictionalized family stories, lightly fictionalized. And this is just really from listening all of my life, from being under the table playing, or, sitting in the living room with my grandparents. It's not eavesdropping. Stories, some of it was, but stories were imparted. They're imparted to you. And this is very much about my mother's family in Melrose Park. And it's got an immigrant matriarch who is very Sicilian, but also becomes very American in her mindset for buying up property, getting houses and then dividing them into flats and putting her children in them and collecting rent from her children and building kind of like a tiny little dynasty in Melrose Park. But also all of the complications when you live on a street where your aunt and your uncle live across the street. There's a lot of visibility into the family, and it's great for children, and sometimes it's difficult for adults. And I really look at, the makeup of that street too, and the various ethnicities that are there. So each chapter has a focus on a different character and what that character's experience is and was. It begins with the grandmother Giuseppa, and it ends with her death. So that's the first book. And this one, Book of the Year, Independent Press from Chicago Writers Association for 2022. So it's
great. Yeah.
It's a good book, and it's on Audible as well. So, I really thought about people maybe who wanted to re-enter the 50s and the 60s in those neighborhoods, but maybe reading the book visually has become difficult. So I did the recording as well, which I think is really nice. And one of the things that I think about a lot is, as a writer and as an Italian-American writer, I often write about things that have to do with Italy, with one foot into potential cultures, trying to understand that. But I also really don't want to typecast myself as if that's the only thing that I can write about, right? Because I can bring those sensibilities, who I am, to a lot of stories, all kinds of stories. So this is the second book that I wrote, and The Way Beauty Comes Apart is actually set in Wales. So it's nowhere near Italy, and it's nowhere near Chicago. But what I understand about people, which I learned from my family and I learned from observing people, is in this book. It's very Welsh, but the mind behind it is very Italian American. So looking at character development, relationships, emotions, vengeance, what happens when, someone trespasses on someone else, what are the ripples that spread out. So it's very human. This one does not have an audio book because I would have to do it in a Welsh accent, which would be false. So I'm not doing that. And that one is told by 14 different narrators in the first person, each telling their story, but they all know each other. So they're crossing over and mixing. And in a way, so is the first book, similar in that way. And then I also recently wrote the introduction for Casa Italia's latest book, Italian Women in Chicago book, which Dominic Candeloro published through Casa Italia. So I've been doing some writing on this front, but it's always in me, right? I don't have to, and I think this is the same for all of us. We don't have to put on the mask of what it is to be Italian American because we're always that. So even if we're writing about Wales or I'm walking down the street, that's housed in me. And I think at the beginning of my understanding, I didn't understand it in that way. But as I've gotten older, I realize it's not something I have to grasp onto. It's in my being, so it doesn't go anywhere.
So how did you research like places in Wales and things like that?
I went to Wales first.
Okay.
I had no intention of writing a book about Wales. It had never occurred to me. I went to Wales kind of on an accident. I was in England, and we were like, let's go to up here and go borrow somebody's caravan, trailer and stay up here in Wales for a little bit. And I got there and I thought, gosh, this place, there's just something, gorgeous about this place and these people and the feeling of it. If you've ever traveled to a place that you wanted to touch the ground and like never leave, I kind of felt like that about Wales. And so I went home and I'm a history person. I'm always interested in who lived here before and what did they feel and what were their lives like. And I just started having these stories popcorning. So I went back 2 more times to Wales. My husband's family is in England, so it wasn't like it was a pretty quick thing. And I was in this particular area, and I had a lot of like, should I be writing these stories? Are they mine to write? Am I stepping on someone else's culture? And if I want to do this, how do I do it correctly? So I started reading all the Welsh short story writers, and I started studying Welsh history, and I kept writing and revising. Then I got a Welsh reader who would read all of my things for accuracy and authenticity. And he was like, these are really good. And then I got a second Welsh editor. So I really did my due diligence. And during that time, interestingly, I went on my ancestry.com and checked out my stuff. And all of a sudden, you know how they refigure
Yeah.
and Wales pops up.
See, there you go.
So then I found the ancestor not that far back, but we didn't know about him because he had died in a cistern. He was gassed to death in a cistern in Springfield about 1904, and his wife remarried later. So we did, and then she had more children, but my line came from him. And so it was really kind of spooky in a way that, you arrive somewhere, you feel so connected to it. You're telling yourself, I have no connection here. And then you find out that there is indeed a genetic connection to it. But I also think as Americans, we have to be really careful. The Welsh people who live there, those are the Welsh people. The Italian people who live in Italy, those are the Italians.
Sure.
I can have an appreciation for it and I can have a connection to it, but it doesn't belong to me.
Yeah, I went to Wales a couple of times. I worked for a bank. I was almost supposed to get a job there, and then it never happened. But I did wind up working several years later in England for 2 years. So that was pretty cool.
Okay. And what did you think of Wales?
Oh, it was great. I mean, I didn't see a lot of it because I was working, but what I saw was beautiful. And of course, England, we loved England because there's just, you could just drive anywhere and there's something. It's not like
right. And Ireland is the same. And Italy is the same. I think, the vastness of America and the relative newness of our architecture and things that we can visually see, for us going to a civilization where there are older things on display everywhere is just really it's magical, right?
We have friends who they're not married any longer, but she was from Jerusalem, and when she was dating her husband, they were living in Delaware, and he took her to one of these reenactment places in Virginia. I forget exactly where, and explaining to her this was what it was like, and she tells the story. It's funny because she says, I walked the same streets as Jesus, and you're showing me this thing that was built 20 years ago that's supposed to look like something that was built 200 years ago.
Right. There's something like even when you're in London, right, there's the Roman wall and you can go touch the Roman wall. And at that point, you're also touching Italy, right? And it's so old. And I think I don't want to know what to call it here, but Americans have a cultural immaturity about mortality and maybe about death in a certain way because we're not surrounded by these artifacts. I think that when you see the ruins of the Roman wall, when you see the fairy fort in Ireland is standing stones in Scotland, every day of your life, you know that there were not just people, but epochs of history that have passed and that you're also in an epoch of history. If you're in Jerusalem, if you're in Iraq, if you're in Italy, if you're in Wales, if you're, standing in the Orkney Islands and there's a stone circle, the memento mori that's there, the part of history that is right now and will end and you'll be followed by something else. Like, I think that that's so much more palpable in places. And I think that's why it's really, really good it's one of the reasons it's really good to travel is that I think as Americans, we don't have the same view of that. because our architecture and our memory as a United States of America is pretty short, comparatively.
Yeah, exactly. And they value their history a lot more than us, I think. We're tearing down things that are 100 years old to put up something that'll be torn down in, 50 years or whatever.
Yeah. And you can go to Ireland and rent a cottage that's, 400 years old that
Yeah,
has been
exactly.
carefully preserved and renovated, is still the cottage and still has the wall. It has, yeah. It
So,
hasn't been shiplapped and
yeah. So I want to go back for a minute back to your dissertation on the Malocchia. Why'd you pick that? And what did you find?
well, first of all, I was at Northern Illinois University, which is not known for any Italian studies program. So I was already like swimming upstream a little bit, right? And it was time to do my dissertation. And I thought, well, I better pick something I'm really interested in because this is a long slog. And I'm fascinated by the fact that my grandfather, when I was a kid, I was sitting in his lap and he had holes in his ears from earrings. And I thought, oh, my grandpa in his wild youth, like what happened? And I asked him, I'm like, Grandpa, why do you have, did you have earrings? And he's like, yeah, Poochie, I had earrings because my mom wanted to make me look like a girl so that the evil eye wouldn't get me. Okay. It was a disguise. Now, as a young girl hearing this, I thought, well, why wouldn't the evil eye, what's going on here? Why is it better to be a boy yet again? Right? You don't have to do the dishes and the evil eye is after you. But anyway, I thought about that and the very real fear of infant mortality that was behind that particular act within the overall, what I would call vernacular religion of the evil eye, because I think of it, it's more than a superstition. It's kind of tied in with Stregeria and trying to control your world. And earlier, I think, ideas of belief systems, pre-Christian ideas of belief systems. And I thought, well, I want to write about that, but I'm in the English department, so I can't write an anthropological study. But I can weave an anthropological study into a study of the literature and then look at the way that Italian American writers are or aren't relaying the evil eye in their work, and, how their characters are dealing with it, and what is it used to do when it shows up in a book, and what does that mean? And so that's what I did. And it was a massive one. And like I said, I was at a great state school in Illinois, but not a school known for Italian American studies, doesn't have a program. So I asked Fred Gardafe to be an outside person on my committee. And we did have some great discussion about it. And I brought something new to NIU and wove. And I think this is really important for Italian American scholars or writers or artists. It's great when our work is in a program or in a space that's just for Italian Americans. I think that's wonderful. But I think it's also wonderful when we pull it in and say, and this is part of America, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is part of literature. It's not in the extra fridge in the basement. And I think that's kind of one of my goals with the writing that I'm doing is, am I writing for Italian Americans? Oh gosh, I really hope that they read my books. And I think they will get a lot and find themselves and see portions of their families in there. But I also want everyone to read them and to recognize us and for us to, really stand in the space of being part of the fabric.
Yeah, no, I do too. And that's kind of why I do this. I know most of the people who listen are Italians or Italian Americans or second to Americans who listen to the podcast are Australia, believe it or not.
Oh, I believe it. Because
Yeah.
when I was in Genova at the Italian Diaspora Italiana conference last December, and there were a lot of Italian Australians there, and they're really doing a lot of work and a lot of preservation, interviewing, the older generations, getting things down, saving the stories. There's a lot of that kind of work from what I could see. I'm sure way more than what I could see going on there. So yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. So before we go, where could people find you if they want to get in touch with you, or where could they find the books?
Okay, so the books are available through your local bookstore. So you can go and request them and they can order them for you. So if you're a person who likes to support the local bookstore, that's what I would do. But they're also available on Amazon and bookshop.org. And if you have questions, you want to just chat with me, ideas, you just want some encouragement in writing, because I think saving our stories is really, really important. You can find me at ChristinaMorocco.com. That is my website. And also I wanted to mention really quickly that I'm the prose editor from Michele Reale's Ovunque Siamo, which is a journal of New Italian American writing. We're always looking for people's nonfiction, fiction, poetry. Our submission process, you can just Google us and look at that online. And, we'd love to help get more Italian American writing into publication and available for others who want to read it.
Oh, that's great. That's super. Yeah, that's a great thing for anybody who's learning to write, starting to write, doesn't know where to go. That's perfect.
Right. And my last plug is, even if you don't fancy yourself a writer, Dominic Candeloro says this all the time too at Casa Italia, save those stories. Get them down. Even if you have to write them in a way that you're not sure is like the way, like they're not ready for other people to read, get them down, because you may work on them later, or someone else may pick them up later, or and they can grow from there. But if we don't capture our stories and our realities, no one else AI may do it and do it really badly, but we want to be able to say who we were and who our ancestors were and what was experienced and why that matters.
Right.
So, I hope that makes people pick up a pen.
I do too. I do too. Well, Christina, this has been great fun. Lots of good information, great stories. So thanks for being here. I appreciate it.
I appreciate you too. Thank you.